artist's curse, when guilt takes form and demands a price. Article: an analysis of monstrous introspection. We are, all of us, haunted by a silent companion. It mimics our every move, a flat, featureless echo tethered to our heels. We call it a shadow, and in the language of symbols, it is the embodiment of our unconscious self, the repressed instincts, the hidden fears, the unacknowledged guilt we refuse to bring into the light. For an artist, this internal landscape is both a wellspring of inspiration and a potential abyss. What happens when that abyss decides to sketch its own portrait? This is the central terror of the shadow that drew itself, a narrative that explores the visceral horror of self-destruction and the crushing weight of guilt, visualized through the stark, chilling animation of a shadow over minimal backgrounds. The premise is deceptively simple. An artist's shadow gains autonomy during his slumber, creating artworks that bleed into reality. The horror here is not one of external monsters, but of an internal rot making itself known. The shadow is not an invading entity. It is a part of the artist, the manifestation of a psyche that can no longer contain its own poison. Its artistic creations are not random acts of violence, but meticulous, symbolic indictments. Each horrifying image it draws is a page from the artist's own book of secrets, a sin given form and function, the visual poetry of starkness, the directive of shadow animation over stark, minimal backgrounds, is a masterstroke of psychological horror. By stripping the environment of detail, the narrative forces an unblinking focus on the two central actors, the man and his silhouette. The emptiness of the room becomes a canvas for the mind, a white-walled asylum where guilt performs its macabre ballet. The shadow's movement is the only animation in a still world, a fluid, ink-black smear against a void. Its detachment from its host is a violation of natural law, a quiet, uncanny event that is more terrifying than any loud bang or shambling corpse. Imagine the scene. The artist, Elias, asleep in a pool of moonlight in his pristine, white-walled studio. His body is still exhausted, but on the wall his shadow peels itself away, stretching like tar, gaining a third dimension it should not possess. It moves to a blank canvas, and its elongated, featureless fingers begin to work. There is no sound but the faint, abrasive scratch of charcoal on stretched linen, a sound that is both creative and destructive. This visual hook is a metaphor for the clarity of self-confrontation. In the minimalism, there is nowhere to hide. The evidence of one's own corruption is displayed in high contrast, undeniable and absolute. Self-destruction as the only path to salvation. The story's core conflict is a devastating paradox. The only way to stop it is to erase his own shadow. This is the ultimate expression of self-destruction as a means of salvation. To destroy the monster, the artist must destroy a fundamental part of himself. The shadow, for all its horror, is his. It is his energy, his drive, his dark inspiration, his very physical presence in a world illuminated by light. To erase it is to become a ghost, a man without a footprint, without substance. This act is a powerful allegory for confronting profound guilt. The things we bury, the lies, the betrayals, the moments of cowardice, do not dissipate. They fester in the darkness of our subconscious, gaining strength and form until they are powerful enough to act on their own behalf. They create consequences, the horrifying images that begin to manifest in real life. The only way to stop this cascade of self-generated catastrophe is to excise the rot at its source, no matter the cost. This requires a brutal, unforgiving introspection, a willingness to annihilate the person you have become to stop the damage you are causing. It is a spiritual amputation. Guilt, the invisible ink. Guilt is the invisible ink in which the shadow draws. Its creations are not generic nightmares, they are hyperspecific. It might sketch the face of a person wronged, their eyes wide with a forgotten pain. It might draw a broken object that symbolizes a shattered promise. It might illustrate the scene of an accident the artist could have prevented. As these drawings gain dimension and seep into the real world, they do not attack like monsters, they accuse. They are constant, inescapable reminders of a failing. The horror is in the recognition. The manifestation of the art is the manifestation of consequence. The artist, Elias, is being forced to live in a gallery of his own crimes, a museum of his moral failings that is becoming increasingly, terrifyingly real. The shadow is thus the ultimate critic. It does not critique his technique, but his soul. And its judgment is absolute, rendered not in words, but in waking nightmares. In the end, the shadow that drew itself is a cautionary tale about the dangers of an unexamined life. It argues that we are all artists, sketching our lives on the canvas of the world, and that the shadows we cast are not empty shapes. They are archives of our every choice. If we refuse to look at them, to acknowledge their content, they may just decide to pick up the charcoal themselves and finish the picture in a way we never intended, but perhaps always feared. And the only way to silence that dark, creative impulse might be to step into a light so absolute that it consumes even the outline of who we are. The first stroke, Elias Thorn worked in a cathedral of white. His studio, a converted loft in a silent part of the city, was a sanctuary of minimalism. White walls, a polished concrete floor, vast north-facing windows that bathed the space in a cool, consistent light. It was a deliberate vacuum, designed to hold nothing but his own creativity. In the center of this void stood his easels, his tabarets smelling of linseed oil and turpentine, and the vibrant, chaotic worlds he brought forth onto canvas. He was celebrated for his use of light and shadow. Critics wrote of the luminosity that seemed to emanate from within his figures, and the darknesses that were not mere absences of light, but palpable, breathing entities. They were more right than they knew. For Elias, shadow was not an effect, it was a character. It had weight, intention, a personality of its own. He often felt he wasn't painting the objects, but the silence and the darkness that clung to them. Lately, however, the darkness felt heavier. It had been 6 months since the accident. A rainy night, a sharp bend in the coastal road, a moment of distracted anger during a phone call. The impact was a sickening crunch of metal and glass. When he'd stumbled from his car, unharmed but for a cut on his forehead, he saw the other vehicle, a small, silver sedan, crumpled against a tree. The driver, a young woman named Clara, did not survive. The official report cited adverse weather conditions. No charges were filed. He was the tragic beneficiary of a heavier, safer car, and a fraction of a second. He attended the funeral anonymously, standing at the back, watching a family shattered by a loss he had caused. He saw her parents, their faces etched with a grief so profound it seemed to warp the air around them. He saw a young man, her fiancé, his body shaking with sobs he could no longer contain. Elias had returned to his white studio and tried to paint, but the colors felt like lies. The light felt false. The only thing that felt real was the heavy, cold stone of guilt sitting in his gut. He started painting darker, more abstract pieces. Jagged lines, mudded palettes. His dealer was concerned. "People want your light, Elias," he'd said over the phone. This is just anguish." One night, exhausted after a 14-hour session that produced nothing but a canvas smeared with a frustrated, ashy gray, Elias collapsed onto his cot in the corner of the studio. The moon was full, its light pouring through the vast windows, casting the familiar, elongated silhouette of his sleeping form onto the far wall. He fell into a deep, troubled sleep, haunted by dreams of silver sedans and the sound of breaking glass that never ceased. He did not see his shadow stir. As his breathing deepened, the dark shape on the wall began to change. It lost its direct correlation to his body. The head turned, though Elias did not. An arm, stretched and thin as a blade, lifted from the torso of the silhouette and reached out, detaching itself from the main mass. It was a fluid, impossible movement, like ink spreading against its will. The shadow slid across the wall, a two-dimensional phantom, until it reached a fresh, primed canvas on an easel. It paused, a featureless head tilting as if in consideration. Then, a single, elongated finger extended from its hand and pressed against the white surface. Where it touched, a black line appeared. Not paint, not charcoal, but a line of pure, light-devouring darkness. It was the essence of shadow given mark-making agency. The shadow began to draw. Its movements were swift, jerky, yet unnervingly precise. It did not sketch outlines, but seemed to pull forms directly from the void. It drew a face. It was the face of Clara, but not as she was in life. This face was contorted in the final moment of impact, eyes wide with terror, mouth open in a silent scream. The rendering was photorealistic in its horror, executed with a technical skill that surpassed Elias' own. The shadow worked tirelessly, filling in the details. The glint of a tear on a cheek, the shattered glass of the windshield reflected in her dilated pupils. When it was finished, it slid back across the wall, reattaching itself to Elias' sleeping form, just as the moon dipped below the skyline. The first thing Elias noticed upon waking was the smell. Not oil or turpentine, but the distinct, metallic scent of rain and gasoline. He sat up, his body aching with a fatigue that sleep had not touched. He rubbed his eyes and looked across the studio, and he saw the drawing. For a long moment, his brain refused to process it. He thought it was a remnant of his nightmare, a phantom projected onto his retina. He blinked, shook his head, but the image remained. It was a masterpiece of horror. The detail was excruciating. He could feel the cold rain, hear the silent scream. Hell, he never worked in monochrome like this. And the style, while brilliant, was not his own. It was colder, more clinical in its depiction of agony. He stumbled out of bed and approached the canvas, his heart hammering against his ribs. He reached out a trembling hand, expecting to feel wet paint or charcoal dust. The surface was smooth and cool. The black lines were not a substance he could identify. They were like strips of velvet darkness, seeming to drink the light from the room. And the smell, it was emanating from the drawing itself. A wave of nausea and panic washed over him. This was his guilt, given form. He had finally cracked. He must have sleepwalked, created this abomination in a fugue state. It was the only explanation. With a surge of revulsion, he grabbed the canvas, ripped it from the easel, and carried it to the large industrial incinerator chute in the corner of the studio. He shoved it in and listened to the whump as the gas ignition caught. He stood there until he was sure it was ash. He spent the day in a haze of fear and self-loathing. He called his dealer and canceled his upcoming show, citing creative block. He drank coffee that tasted like acid and tried to ignore the phantom scent of gasoline that seemed to have permeated the studio. That night, he took sleeping pills. He would not sleepwalk. He would not dream. But the shadow needed neither his consciousness nor his dreams. It needed only his presence and the darkness. Again, as he lay in a chemical stupor, his silhouette peeled itself from the wall. This time, it did not go to a canvas. It flowed across the floor, a slick of darkness, until it reached a bare section of the white wall. Its finger began to trace, larger this time, more ambitious. It drew the silver sedan. It rendered the crushed driver's side door, the spider-webbed windshield, the twisted metal gleaming under a phantom moon. The drawing was life-size, a panoramic mural of the accident scene. And in the background, barely suggested but unmistakable, was the grille of Elias' own car. Elias woke to the sound of dripping. A steady, maddening plink, plink, plink. He opened his eyes. The studio was dim, the pre-dawn light struggling through the windows. The dripping sound was coming from the wall. He turned his head and saw the crash. He screamed, a raw, guttural sound that tore from his throat. The wall was no longer white. It was a detailed, horrifying diorama of the accident, and it was wet. A dark, viscous fluid oil. Blood, was seeping from the rendered gas tank of the drawn car, gathering in a glistening pool on the floor before dripping down the wall. The smell was overwhelming. Burnt rubber, hot metal, and the coppery tang of blood. He scrambled back, falling out of his cot, his eyes fixed on the monstrous artwork. It was impossible. It was a hallucination. He was losing his mind. He spent the morning trying to scrub the wall clean, but the image wouldn't budge. The black lines were as permanent as tattoos on the plaster. The fluid kept seeping, no matter how much he wiped. In the end, he dragged his largest bookcase in front of the mural, hiding it from view. But he could still smell it. He could still hear the dripping. This was no sleepwalking episode. This was something else, something demonic.